gay people come from. And that's where gay people come from.
Have you ever had that happen to you? Well, this is where gay people come from, at least in Mexico.
Gay people didn't just appear, no matter what your homophobic uncle named Juan may claim. We've actually been here since the dawn of time, since before the label homosexual or gay was established, as well as relatively new in comparison to the dawn of modern civilization in Latin America. How do we know this? Well, it's undeniable that we don't have the best records of pre-Columbus Americas, and what we do have is glorified and unfactual Spanish records. However, we can take notes of these records and try to piece together a narrative that can be somewhat factual. So let's start with the Hoyas. Among the Chumash and many other names across the Americas, these individuals were recognized as embodying both masculine and feminine qualities, embodying a third gender or two-spirit. They were mediators, spiritual guides, and healers, highly respected and coveted members of their society. Next, the story of Quetzalcoatl and Emperor.
Aksayakatl,
In 1479, a Chalcan musician named Quetzalcoatl led a protest performance for the powerful Aztec Empire.
Aksayakatl,
Performance carried a hidden message about Chalco's oppression of their tribal women by the Aztecs. The emperor summoned Quetzalcoatl and was basically like, hey, that was great. Also, you're kind of hot. While we can note that the relationship was respected and even celebrated, we gotta acknowledge the homophobia in Aztec society, where homosexuality and sodomy was punishable by death. So many statues doing so many things. We not only see the gays in the everyday life of Mesoamerican people, but also in their mythology. The story of Xochipilli and his sister, Xochiquetzal, Aztec god of art, music, and pleasure, and the goddess of beauty and love. In Aztec mythology, the god Xochipilli, known as the Fire Prince, embodied art, dance, and gays, plus male prostitutes, while Xochipilli's twin sister, Xochiquetzal, is the goddess of love and beauty, embodying femininity, sexuality, and lesbians, plus female prostitutes. Chin, the Mayan deity of male companionship in Mayan culture, is basically associated with male companionships, aka the reason as to why gays are in Mayan society according to Mayans. The arrival of colonizers. When Europeans arrived, they brought their own strict ideas about what was right or natural when it came to gender and sexuality. Suddenly, identities that indigenous societies had embraced for centuries were labeled as sinful and wrong. Colonization was like a sledgehammer aimed at erasing queer identities from Latin America altogether. Violent persecution of third gender people. Take what happened to third gender people in California, people called Hoyas who had been respected members of their communities. To the Spanish, though, Hoyas didn't fit into their rigid gender norms, so they went after them in brutal ways, setting attack dogs on Hoyas trained to kill. Spanish soldiers literally unleashed these huge, terrifying dogs on third gender people, trying to scare everyone else into obedience and wipe out those who didn't conform, framing as a way to erase identity. And it wasn't just violence. The Spanish also used language to erase indigenous identities. In California, Hoya originally meant jewel, like a precious person with an important role. But when the Spanish came, they turned Hoya into something shameful. Instead of using indigenous words for people with different genders or sexualities, they started calling them things like sodomite or hermaphrodite, as if these identities were something dirty. It was their way of renaming and reshaping indigenous lives to fit Spanish norms. Religion as a tool of control. Religious condemnations by the Inquisition. The Spanish Catholic Church also had a big hand in this. Priests saw indigenous beliefs as dangerous, especially when it came to sexuality, so the Inquisition in Mexico got involved, punishing people for anything they saw as deviant. They'd document same-sex relationships for anyone who didn't fit their gender norms, and it was considered a serious offense. To them, it was more than just a rule-breaking thing. It was a threat to their control, surveillance, and forced confession. Confession became their tool for control. Priests required indigenous people to confess things that to them weren't even wrong. They were forced to admit to sins that had been completely normal in their culture. There's this case of a woman named Augusta Ruiz who had been dragged in front of the church for what she thought and believed. They punished her for having visions that didn't line up with Christian beliefs, showing how confession was used to dig into people's personal lives and stamp out indigenous practices. Alright, so let's talk about where homophobia in Mexico partly comes from. A lot of it goes back to this thing called machismo. Machismo isn't just about being manly. It's this deep-rooted idea that enforces these strict gender roles, where men are supposed to be aggressive, unemotional, and always in control. Here's where it gets messy, because machismo puts masculinity on this pedestal. Anything seen as not manly enough, like being gay or just expressing emotion openly, gets judged hard. Basically, if you don't fit the macho image, you're seen as weak or wrong, which has led to a lot of homophobia. Research actually shows a strong link between high levels of machismo and anti-gay attitudes. In a machismo mindset, being gay or lesbian is viewed as breaking these sacred gender rules. Men who don't act manly enough or women who aren't traditionally feminine are seen as crossing this kind of invisible line. And for people who buy into machismo, that feels like a threat to everything they think they know about gender roles. This mindset has real effects. People who believe in these strict macho roles are more likely to avoid LGBTQ people or keep them at a distance. They might see queer people as a bad influence or just different, which leads to discrimination and isolation. And since machismo has been part of the culture for so long, this kind of prejudice has gotten passed down, normalized, and even expected. Machismo doesn't just affect LGBTQ people directly. It affects everyone by enforcing strict rules for how men and women should act. It pressures men to constantly prove they're masculine and shames anyone who doesn't fit that image. For LGBTQ people, especially gay men, it can mean dealing with intense homophobia simply for living in a way that challenges these rigid expectations. What's interesting is that machismo doesn't just impact men, it affects women's views on LGBTQ people too. Even though women tend to be more accepting of gay men in a culture driven by machismo, they can still end up enforcing these strict gender roles. It's not just men upholding the system. Machismo shapes everyone's views on what's acceptable. Then there's the role of Catholic beliefs, which adds another layer to the whole thing. Religious teachings often view queerness as a sinful, which combines with machismo to push LGBTQ identities and even further into the shadows, making the homophobia even worse. The influence of machismo runs deep in Mexican culture, but it's not unbreakable. Younger generations are starting to question these ideas and promote a more open and inclusive view of gender and sexuality. Queerness in Mexico today is in a strange place. On one hand, homophobia is still a big issue in a lot of areas, but on the other, there's been so much progress, legally, socially, and in how visible LGBTQ people are becoming. Let's start with the challenges. One example that shows how homophobia is still hanging around is the chants you hear at soccer games. It's been called out by FIFA, it's called Mexico Soccer Federation millions in fines, and yet people still keep doing it. Some see it as tradition, but it's a reminder of how casual homophobia is still treated as no big deal in parts of Mexican culture. Just because something is tradition doesn't mean it's something we should keep practicing. For a lot of LGBTQ plus people, especially in smaller towns, coming out isn't just scary, it can feel impossible, and in a handful of cases, even deadly. Family expectations and traditional values can make it really hard to live openly. Some people face rejection, isolation, or even violence. Even though there are legal protections now, true acceptance still feels far off in places where these old values run deep. But there's been incredible progress, too. Same-sex marriage is now legal in all 32 states. It took decades of activism and legal fights to get here. But now, queer couples can marry, adopt, and build families with full legal protection. It's a huge deal. It's a level of recognition that wasn't even on the radar a few generations ago. Literally, the last state legalized it in 2023. Representation is also improving, especially in media. One novela that sticks with me is the teenage gay romance from Mi Marido Tiene Más Familia. Watching it as a kid with my mom, who was so open and accepting about it, made me feel safer and more comfortable as a queer Latina in the closet. Shows like that are so powerful. They help break down stereotypes and show that LGBTQ stories have a real place in Mexican culture and are just as normal as any other story. Things aren't perfect, but there's so much hope. Younger generations are questioning old ideas and standing for LGBTQ plus rights, whether it's through legal wins, better representation, or just people being more open. Mexico is slowly becoming a more inclusive place, and the change is real, and the future looks brighter every day. We just gotta keep stepping forward, one gay foot at a time. I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what that was.